I was 4 years old the first time I left. I do not know how else to say it. I was 4 years old and I was asleep in the small house in rural Illinois where my family lived, and I went somewhere. Not in the way that children go somewhere in dreams, the fluid and inconsistent somewhere of a mind that is processing and reorganizing and generating images from the material of its waking life. I went somewhere real. Somewhere that had weight and substance and a quality of presence so complete and so specific that 20 years later I can still close my eyes and be there. Still feel the light on whatever I had instead of skin. Still hear the music that was not music in any sense that the word music was designed to contain. I was 4 years old. And I came back with something. Not a memory exactly. Something more active than a memory. Something that needed to come out of me the way water needs to find its way through rock, not because it chose to but because the nature of what it was made containment impossible. Something that had been given to me in a place where giving was the substance of the atmosphere, and that now, inside the small unlimited container of a 4-year-old body in a small house in Illinois, was pressing outward from every direction. I picked up a pencil. I had never drawn before. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters to the account I am about to give you. I was 4 years old and I had not been taught to draw. My family did not have art supplies. We did not have money for art supplies. We were a family that existed, in those years, at the edges of what is comfortable and sometimes past those edges. My parents were working through the particular difficulties of building a life with young children and insufficient resources, and the specific and daily grind of circumstances that do not allow for extras. I picked up a pencil and I drew the face of Jesus. Not a child's drawing of a face. Not the approximate and endearing scrawl of a 4-year-old who is trying to represent a human being with a circle and 2 dots and a curved line. Something else. Something that the people who saw it did not know how to account for. Something that had a quality in it that the pencil and the paper and the 4-year-old hand holding the pencil had no business producing. My mother stood in the doorway of that room and looked at what I had made. And she did not say what she would have said if what she was looking at was a child's drawing. She did not say how lovely or how wonderful or any of the things that mothers say when they are encouraging without necessarily meaning what they say. She stood in the doorway and she was quiet. For a long time. Quiet in the way that people are quiet when they encounter something they do not have an immediate category for. When the thing in front of them is reaching past the frameworks available to them and touching something underneath the frameworks. Something was happening in her daughter. Something she did not yet understand. Neither did I. All I knew was that the place I had been was more real than the room I was in. That the light I had seen made the light coming through our windows look like a rough approximation of what light was supposed to be. That the face I had drawn was a face I had seen, clearly, specifically, in the way that you see the face of someone who is looking directly at you with complete and personal attention. And that the drawing was not adequate to the face but that it was the closest I could come with what I had. I went back to sleep. And the next morning I went back to the pencil. Let me tell you who I was before I tell you where I went. My name is Akiane Kramarik. I was born on July 9, 1994, in Mount Morris, Illinois. My mother was Lithuanian. My father was American. I was the oldest of 4 children in a family that, in those early years, was entirely non-religious. My parents did not attend church. We did not own a Bible. We did not pray before meals or celebrate religious holidays in any way that carried meaning beyond the cultural. God was not a presence in our household in any form that I had been taught to recognize. And yet from the time I could speak, I talked about things that my non-religious household had given me no vocabulary for. About a place I visited when I slept. About beings I encountered there. About a light that I could not describe in the words available to a small child and that I kept reaching for anyway, kept pointing toward the way you point at something that is right there and that the person you are pointing to somehow cannot see. My mother did not know what to do with what I was telling her. She was not dismissive. She was a mother who paid attention to her children in the specific and careful way of someone who understood that what children say is worth listening to, even when, especially when, it does not fit easily into the frameworks available to adults. She listened. She took notes. She sat with what she was hearing and tried to find a place in her understanding for it. She could not find a place. Because what I was describing did not fit into anything she had been given to understand the world with. The visions began coming when I was awake as well. Not hallucinations. I want to be careful about that word because I know it is the word that a certain kind of mind reaches for immediately when a child describes seeing things that other people cannot see. What I experienced was not the dissolution of reality, was not an inability to distinguish between what was physically present and what was not. What I experienced was, and I have spent years trying to find the right language for this, more like an additional layer of perception. Like being able to see a frequency of light that most people's eyes are not calibrated to receive. I saw things. Real things. Things that were there whether or not anyone else could perceive them. And the things I saw had a quality to them that the physical world I was navigating as a small child did not have, a quality of aliveness, of intention, of being in relationship with me rather than simply existing in my vicinity. I began to paint. I was 6 years old when I picked up a brush for the first time. The results were, and I am not saying this to perform humility or to set up a contrast, I am saying it because it is what happened, the results were not what a 6-year-old child who has never been taught to paint produces. The results were something that the people who saw them responded to with the same quality of quiet that my mother had produced when she stood in the doorway looking at my first drawing. Something was coming through me. Something that had a source outside of me, or rather, a source that I now understand to be so much larger than me that the distinction between inside and outside barely applies. Something that needed to be expressed and that was using the particular and unlikely vessel of a small girl in rural Illinois with no formal training and no access to the kind of education that produces the technical skills visible in what I was making. I was not making it. It was being made through me. And the source of what was being made through me was the place I went when I slept. The place that was more real than this one. The place with the light that the word light is not adequate to describe and the music that the word music is not adequate to contain and the presence that the word God points toward the way a finger points toward the moon, accurately, necessarily, and with an inadequacy that the moon itself does not mind because the moon is still there regardless of whether the pointing finger is sufficient. And then one night, I was 8 years old, I went back. Not the gentle and fragmentary visits of the years before. Not the impressions and the colors and the sense of having been somewhere that I woke carrying but could not fully reconstruct. I went back completely. With the full and present awareness of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows they have arrived and is paying attention with everything they have. And what I found there, what was waiting for me, what had always been waiting for me, what I now understand had been sending me fragments of itself for 4 years to prepare me for the fullness of what I was about to receive, was something that shattered every framework I had for understanding what reality was. And replaced it with something so much larger that the word larger is not adequate either. I was 8 years old. And I was home. The first thing I became aware of was the absence of weight. Not weightlessness in the way that physics describes it, the floating neutrality of a body in zero gravity, still present, still occupying space, simply freed from the downward pull of a planet. Something more complete than that. Something that implied not the removal of a force acting on me but the removal of the condition that made force necessary. As if the weight I had been carrying, not just the physical weight of a body but the specific and accumulating weight of being a finite thing in an infinite universe, of being a small thing in a vast thing, of being a knowing thing surrounded by so much more than it could ever fully know, as if all of that had simply been set down. And I was what remained after the setting down. I was 8 years old and I had been asleep in our house in Illinois, and now I was somewhere that made the house in Illinois feel like a very small room that I had been standing in with my face pressed against the wall, unable to see the space behind me. And now I had turned around. The space behind me was infinite. The light was the first thing. I want to try to describe it more precisely than I have ever described it before because I think precision matters here. Because the light in that place is not incidental to what the place is, it is not the illumination of something else, it is not a feature of the environment the way lighting is a feature of a room. The light in that place is the place. It is what the place is made of. It is the substance of the atmosphere, the material of everything I perceived, the reason anything was visible at all, not because it was shining on things but because it was the things. Because everything I could perceive was made of it, was an expression of it, was the light taking specific and particular forms without ever ceasing to be light. And it was alive. I need you to receive that word carefully. Alive not as a metaphor. Not alive the way we sometimes say a piece of music is alive or a painting is alive to mean that it has a quality of vitality, a sense of presence, an energy that exceeds what the materials alone could account for. Alive in the way that beings are alive, conscious, aware, responsive, in relationship. The light knew I was there. The light was aware of me in the specific and personal way that a parent is aware of a child who has just entered the room, not as a general awareness of another presence but as the immediate and particular recognition of this specific child, this specific person, this irreplaceable individual whose arrival is not simply registered but welcomed. The light welcomed me. I thought later, years later, when I had the theological vocabulary to reach for Scripture and find that Scripture had been waiting for me to reach for it, I thought of 1 John chapter 1 verse 5. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. I had been raised in a family with no religion. I had not read that verse. I did not know that verse existed. And yet what I was standing inside was the most precise possible illustration of it, not as a theological statement about the nature of God but as a literal physical description of what it is like to be in the presence of God. There is no darkness at all. Not a diminishment of darkness. Not darkness held at bay by the presence of light. The complete and structural absence of darkness as a possibility. Because darkness is the absence of light, and in that place light was everything, and therefore darkness was not simply absent, it was impossible. God is light. I was standing inside God. And God was looking at me. Not looking at me the way you look at something you are observing. Looking at me the way you look at something you made. The way a sculptor looks at a piece they have worked on for a long time, with a specific and intimate knowledge of every choice that went into it, every difficulty that was encountered and resolved, every moment when the material resisted and had to be worked with rather than against. That kind of looking. The looking of someone who knows you from the inside out because they were on the inside when you were being formed. I was 8 years old, and the creator of the universe was looking at me with that kind of attention. And his response to everything he saw, every fragment of my 8 years, every moment of confusion and wonder and the particular difficulty of being a child who perceived things that no one around her had language for, his response to all of it was love so complete and so warm and so specifically directed at me that the word love seems almost too small to use for it. Too worn by ordinary usage. Too diminished by being applied to the thousands of smaller things we use it for. But it is the right word. It is the only word. And it was the most real thing I have ever experienced in my life. The beings appeared next. I had seen them before, in the fragmentary visits of the previous 4 years, in the impressions and the colors that I woke carrying and tried to put into paint. But I had seen them the way you see something through a window at night, present, real, but filtered by the glass and the distance and the darkness between you and them. Now there was no glass. No distance. No darkness. They were there. And they were enormous. I want to stay with that word because I think the scale of them is one of the things that is most difficult to communicate and most important to receive. Enormous, not in the way that makes you feel small, not the enormousness of something that diminishes you by contrast. Enormous in the way that the sky is enormous, vast in a way that makes you feel not small but contained. Held. Part of something so much larger than yourself that the larger thing, rather than crushing you, reveals you. Gives you context. Gives you a scale against which you can finally understand your own significance. They were enormous, and they were specific. Each one distinct. Each one radiating a quality of presence so particular and so unmistakable that they could not be confused with any other, the way every human face is specific, the way every voice is specific, the way every person who has ever lived is irreducibly themselves and not interchangeable with any other person who has ever lived. These beings had that quality of irreducible specificity, multiplied by something I have no adequate language for. They were more themselves than anything I had ever encountered. More particular. More present. And they were full of something I can only describe as purposeful joy. Not happiness. Not the undifferentiated positive effect of beings in a pleasant situation. Joy that was structural, joy that was not something they were experiencing as a result of their circumstances but something they were made of. The material of their existence. The substance of what they were. And it was directed, not randomly, not generally, but specifically. directed at the work they were doing, at the carrying and the sustaining and the moving through that place with the particular and joyful competence of beings who had been made for exactly this and who found in the doing of it not labor but the fullest possible expression of what they were. I thought of Ezekiel chapter 1. And I have to stop here because I need to tell you what it means to be 8 years old and to have encountered something and to later open a book, a very old book, written by a man who lived 2,600 years ago on the other side of the world in a completely different culture speaking a completely different language, and to read his description of what he saw and to feel the specific and electric recognition of someone reading an account of something they were there for. Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 4 through 28. A man is standing by the river Chebar in Babylon when the heavens open and he sees what he describes as a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. And from within the fire he sees 4 living creatures, beings with the likeness of a human form but with 4 wings and with the appearance of burnished bronze and with eyes covering their wings and with the sound of their movement like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. He was doing what I do. He was reaching for the most precise language available to him, the most specific images his culture and his vocabulary could provide, and using them to point at something that exceeded the capacity of any language to fully contain. The windstorm and the flashing lightning and the burnished bronze were not the thing itself. They were the closest he could come. They were the finger pointing at the moon. And the moon was what I was standing in front of. The same moon Ezekiel had stood in front of. The same beings. The same light. The same overwhelming and specific and joyful presence of creatures so far beyond what our physical world prepares us to encounter that the encounter itself requires years of sitting with and writing about and painting and still never being fully expressed. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down. When I saw it, I fell face down. I was 8 years old and I understood exactly what Ezekiel meant. Not academically, not theologically. From the inside of the same experience. The impulse to fall face down is not a religious performance. It is the only appropriate physical response to being in the presence of something so real and so vast and so completely beyond the scale of anything you have ever encountered that standing upright seems not merely insufficient but almost absurd. I did not fall face down because I had been taught that was what you did in the presence of God. I fell face down because it was the only thing my body knew how to do. And then the music began. Or rather, I became aware that the music had been there the entire time. That it was not something that started but something that I had gradually become capable of perceiving. The way your eyes adjust to light after darkness, not the light arriving but your capacity to receive it coming online. The music had been there since the moment I arrived. It was part of what the place was made of, the way the light was part of what the place was made of. It was woven into the substance of everything. And it was unlike anything that the word music was designed to describe. I have been a painter since I was 4 years old and I have spent my life trying to put on canvas what I experienced in that place, the light, the beings, the colors that exceed the visible spectrum, the quality of love that was the atmosphere of everything. And the music defeated me more completely than any of the other elements. Because painting can reach toward light and toward form and toward color. Painting cannot reach toward sound. And the sound of that place was perhaps the most overwhelming and most specific thing about it. It was not composed. That is the first thing I need to say about it. It was not arranged by someone. It was not performed by someone. It was not the product of instruments or voices or any source that could be identified and pointed to. It was more like, and I have sat with this description for years, it was more like the sound of everything being fully itself simultaneously. The sound of reality operating at complete capacity. The sound of every frequency that has ever existed or ever will exist, present at once, in a harmony so perfect and so complete that the word harmony is not adequate because harmony implies the resolution of potential discord, and in that place there was no potential discord to resolve. There was only this. The sound of everything being what it was made to be. I thought of Revelation chapter 4 verses 8 through 11. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. Day and night they never cease. Not because they are compelled to. Not because it is their obligation or their assignment or the task they have been given and must perform. Because they are in the presence of the thing that makes ceasing impossible. Because to be fully in the presence of what I was in the presence of is to worship the way a river is to flow, not as a choice but as the only possible expression of what you are when you are fully what you are in the presence of what made you. The music was worship. And the worship was joy. And the joy was the most real thing I had ever heard. And then he came toward me. I had been aware of the light and the beings and the music as a kind of total environment, surrounding me, holding me, communicating with me in ways that did not require the boundaries of individual identity that we depend on in physical life. But now something was approaching with a different quality of presence. Distinct. Specific. Moving toward me the way a person moves toward you when they have crossed a room with the deliberate intention of reaching exactly you, out of everyone else who might be in that room. He was not what I expected. I want to be careful here because I know the danger of that sentence. I know that he was not what I expected has become, in the retelling of these experiences, almost a formula, a way of signaling authenticity by contrasting the encounter with the cultural images we have all absorbed. I am not using it as a formula. I am telling you the literal truth of what happened to an 8-year-old girl raised in a household with no religious imagery, no church attendance, no Sunday school portraits of Jesus on classroom walls. I had no image to contrast him with. And yet I knew exactly who he was. Not because I recognized him from a picture. Because something in me recognized him the way you recognize the source of your own existence, not through external comparison but through internal resonance, the way a key recognizes the lock it was made for. There was no gap between encountering him and knowing him. The knowing arrived simultaneously with the encountering, complete and certain and requiring no further confirmation. His eyes were the first thing I could fully take in. I have spent 20 years since that night trying to paint those eyes. I have made more than one attempt, each one an approximation that comes closer and still falls short, because what I am working with, pigment and canvas, and the physical limitations of a medium designed to represent the visible world, was never built to capture what I encountered. The eyes held something that I can only describe as complete knowledge held inside complete tenderness. As if he knew everything about everyone who had ever lived, and his response to that total knowledge, in every single case, was love so specific and so unwavering that the weight of all that knowing did not crush the love. It expanded it. He knew me. Every fragment of my 8 years. Every confusion I had carried about why I saw things other children did not see. Every moment of feeling strange, set apart, unable to fully explain myself to the people who loved me. He held all of it. And his response to all of it was not correction, was not the gentle adjustment of a teacher pointing out where a student has gone astray. It was recognition, as if he had been waiting for me to arrive at an understanding I already possessed somewhere deeper than my conscious mind could access. As if my strangeness was not a deviation from what I was supposed to be, but the precise and necessary shape of what I had been made for. I thought of John chapter 1 verse 1 through 3. Long after that night, when I had begun to read scripture for the first time as an older child trying to understand what had happened to me, I came to those verses and felt something close to vertigo. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. All things were made through him. I had stood in the presence of the one through whom everything that exists came into existence. The light I had perceived as the substance of that place. He was the source of it, not a being illuminated by it. The fountain from which it flowed. Everything I had perceived as overwhelming and vast and beyond category was, I now understood, a fraction of what was standing directly in front of me, deliberately reduced to a form an 8-year-old child could encounter without being destroyed by the encounter. He had made himself small enough for me to receive him. That, I think, is one of the most important things I can tell you about what God is like. Not a being so vast that he cannot be approached. A being so vast that he chooses, again and again, with infinite patience and infinite tenderness, to make himself approachable. To meet each person at the exact scale they can survive. To show a 4-year-old fragments and an 8-year-old more, and to keep revealing, slowly, only as much as the vessel receiving it can hold without breaking. He showed me something then. Not with words exactly, though I want to be precise that there was language involved. that communication in that place was not the wordless transmission some other accounts describe, but something more like language operating at a depth and a clarity that physical speech can only gesture toward. He showed me, and told me, that I had been given something specific to do. I was to paint what I had seen. Not as a hobby. Not as a charming and unusual talent that a gifted child happens to possess. As a commission. As a task assigned with the same seriousness that a king assigns a mission to someone he trusts completely with something of enormous consequence. I was 4 years old when the drawing began, and I understand now what my mother could not have understood standing in that doorway. She was not watching a child discover an interesting hobby. She was watching the beginning of an assignment. I was shown, in that conversation that was not quite a conversation in any ordinary sense, the shape of what was being asked of me. That I would paint his face so that people who had never had an experience like mine could look at something and feel, even faintly, even for a moment, what it is to stand in front of him. That the paintings were not going to be decorative. They were going to be doorways. Imperfect, limited, never fully adequate, but doorways nonetheless, through which something of what I had received could reach people who would never themselves be carried to the place I had been carried to. I thought of Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 2. Write the vision and make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. I had not read Habakkuk at 8 years old. I have read it many times since, and every time I arrive at that verse I think of a small girl with a pencil, told to make plain on paper what she had seen so that others, running past it in the busy motion of their lives, might catch sight of something real even in the briefest glance. The vision was not for me alone. It had never been for me alone. I had been the vessel chosen to carry something that was meant, from before I was formed, to travel beyond the boundaries of my own small life and reach people I would never meet, in circumstances I could not imagine, at moments of need I had no way of foreseeing. And then he asked me something. Not a question with a yes or no answer. A question that was really an invitation, communicated the way everything in that place was communicated, directly, completely, without the possibility of misunderstanding but also without the imposition of compulsion. He asked if I was willing to carry what I had seen back into a world that had not seen it. Back into a body. Back into the specific and limited container of a small girl's life, with all the difficulty that would come from carrying something this large inside something this small. I said yes. I want you to understand what that yes cost, even though I was only 8 years old and even though the cost was not yet fully visible to me in that moment. Saying yes meant choosing to leave a place where I was completely known and completely understood and return to a place where almost no one would understand what had happened to me. Where I would spend years being looked at strangely, being questioned, being doubted, being asked by well-meaning adults whether I was certain I had not simply seen a picture somewhere and absorbed it into an overactive imagination. Saying yes meant choosing isolation in exchange for purpose. I chose it anyway. Because in his presence, the choice did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like the most natural extension of who I already was. The way a river does not experience flowing toward the sea as sacrifice. It experiences it as simply being a river. And then, gradually, the way dawn arrives rather than the way a door slams, I became aware that the visit was ending. Not abruptly. Not with any sense of being expelled or rushed. With the same tenderness that had characterized everything in that place, a gentle and patient transition, the kind that respects how much a small body and a small mind can absorb in a single encounter, even an encounter with eternity itself. The light began to recede. Not disappear. Recede. The way the tide recedes, fully present, fully real, simply moving to a different position relative to where I stood. I understood, without being told, that the place I had been was not somewhere I was leaving permanently. It was somewhere I would return to, in fragments, in glimpses, throughout the years ahead, each time I picked up a brush and tried again to make plain on canvas what I had seen. And then I was in my bed. In the small house in Illinois. The night air ordinary around me, the moonlight through the window the same moonlight that had been there before, except that nothing about it looked the same to me anymore, because I now knew what that light pointed toward and what lay beyond every ordinary thing I would ever look at again. I got up. I found paper. And I began, with the specific and quiet determination of someone who has been given an assignment and intends to spend the rest of her life fulfilling it, to try to make plain what I had seen. I did not know yet how many years that would take. I did not know yet what it would cost me, in isolation and doubt and the particular loneliness of carrying something that almost no one around me could fully receive. And I did not know yet about the boy in Nebraska. The boy who would one day, without ever having met me, without ever having seen anything I had painted before that moment, look at a portrait I had spent years working toward and say the words that would confirm, beyond any possibility of doubt, that what I had seen and what he had seen were the same place. That confirmation was still years away. But the painting that would carry it had already begun. I want to tell you about the years between that night and the painting that would change everything. Because I think it matters. Because I think there is a temptation, when you hear a story like mine, to skip from the vision to the validation, from the 8-year-old girl who said yes in a place of overwhelming light to the moment, years later, when the world finally had a way to verify that what she had seen was real. And skipping that distance does a disservice to what those years actually cost. To what it means to carry something this large inside a body this young, in a world that has very few categories for receiving it. I was different after that night. Not dramatically, in the way that makes for an easy before and after narrative. differently in the way that something fundamental shifts in the architecture of a life, and the people around that life notice the change without always being able to name it. I painted more. I painted with an intensity that worried my parents at times, long hours, a focus that seemed to exceed what a child my age should be capable of sustaining, a relationship to the work that was less like a hobby and more like a debt being slowly repaid. I was also, in those years, profoundly alone, not unloved. My family loved me, in the particular and sometimes confused way that families love a child who has brought something into the household that no one quite knows how to hold. But alone in the deeper sense, alone in the specific isolation of carrying an experience that almost no one around me could fully receive. I would try to describe what I had seen and watch the careful, polite confusion settle onto the faces of adults who did not know whether they were listening to a remarkable spiritual experience or the elaborate imagination of a gifted and unusual child. I learned to say less. Not because I doubted what had happened. I never doubted it. The memory of that night was, and remains, more solid and more certain to me than almost anything else in my conscious experience. I learned to say less because I understood, gradually and painfully, that words alone were not going to be sufficient to convey what I needed to convey. That if I was going to fulfill what I had been asked to do, I was going to need to let the painting speak in a language that did not require anyone to simply take my word for it. So I painted. For years. Through childhood and into adolescence, developing a technical skill that exceeded what any formal training could have produced in someone my age, because the skill was never really the point. The skill was the vessel. What mattered was what was being carried inside it. And in 2003, I was 9 years old, I began work on a painting that would become the most significant thing I had ever made. I called it Prince of Peace. I want to tell you what it was like to paint that face. Because painting his face was not like painting any other subject I had ever attempted. It required something different from me, not just technical precision but a kind of surrender, a willingness to let the memory of that night guide my hand more directly than my conscious skill ever could. I worked on it for months. I would paint, and step back, and feel the gap between what was on the canvas and what I remembered, and return to close that gap a little further, knowing I would never close it completely but unwilling to stop trying. When I finished it, something in me recognized that this was the closest I had come. This was the painting that would become a doorway for more people than any other work I had created. The eyes held something that even I, looking at my own work with the most critical eye I possessed, could not fully account for. People who saw it would later describe an experience of being looked at by the painting, not observing it but being observed by it, the same quality of complete and tender knowing that I had experienced directly in that place years before. I did not know, when I finished that painting, what was about to happen. I did not know about a 4-year-old boy in Imperial, Nebraska, who at that exact period of time was lying in a hospital bed in Greeley, Colorado, his appendix ruptured, his small body fighting an infection that had been spreading for days. I did not know that he was about to have an experience that would, in its essential details, mirror my own so closely that the two of us, separated by age, by geography, by every circumstance that should have made our experiences entirely independent of each other, were about to become two witnesses to the same reality. I am speaking, of course, about Colton Burpo. If you have watched his testimony here on this channel, you already know fragments of what I am about to tell you. If you have not, I want to encourage you to find it, because what happened between his experience and mine is one of the most remarkable confirmations available anywhere of what both of us are telling you is real. Colton was 4 years old when he died briefly on an operating table and was shown heaven. Among the things he described when he began, slowly and in pieces, to tell his parents what he had seen, was the face of Jesus. He described eyes of a particular and striking color. He described markers on his hands and his feet. He described a presence that he, a small boy with no more theological vocabulary than I had possessed at his age, struggled to find words adequate for. Years passed. Colton grew. His family eventually shared his story publicly. And at some point, in the providence of a God who does not waste a single detail and who had been arranging this convergence long before either Colton or I were born, Colton was shown my painting, Prince of Peace. The painting I had labored over for months, trying to close the gap between memory and canvas, trying to make plain what I had seen so that it could reach people who had not themselves been carried to that place. Colton looked at the painting, and he said the words that would confirm, for thousands of people who would later hear this story, that what we had both experienced was not coincidence and was not imagination and was not the separate and unrelated products of two unusually creative children. That's him. That's what Jesus looks like. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think its significance is easy to move past too quickly. A 4-year-old boy, who had never met me, who had never seen anything I had painted prior to that moment, who had his own independent and verifiable experience of meeting Jesus during a medical emergency that nearly killed him, looked at a painting made by a girl on the other side of the country, a painting created from a vision that occurred years before his own, and recognized it immediately and without hesitation as a true likeness of what he himself had seen. 2 children, 2 separate cities, 2 separate medical circumstances, mine occurring during ordinary sleep, his during emergency surgery. 2 separate families, one religious, one not. 2 experiences, occurring years apart, that should have had no reason to align in any specific or verifiable way. And they aligned completely. I thought of 2 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 1, where Paul writes that every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. I had not sought a second witness. I had not arranged for Colton to see my painting in order to validate my own experience. The convergence was not engineered by either of us. It happened the way God arranges things, quietly, patiently, across years and across distance, until the moment arrives when two independent testimonies meet and the truth they were each carrying separately becomes, suddenly, undeniable together. This is how God confirms what He reveals. Not always with thunder and dramatic intervention. Sometimes with a 4-year-old boy looking at a painting made by a girl he had never met and saying, without prompting, without leading, without anyone suggesting to him what he was supposed to see, "That's him." I have carried that moment with me every day since I learned of it. Because it told me something I needed desperately to hear after years of isolation and doubt and the particular loneliness of describing something almost no one around me could verify. It told me I had not imagined it. It told me the place was real. It told me He was real. And it told me that the assignment I had said yes to in that overwhelming light so many years before was not a private delusion belonging only to me. It was a shared testimony, being assembled, witness by witness, painting by painting, story by story, across a world that desperately needs to hear that heaven is real and that the God who reigns there is exactly as tender and exactly as magnificent as both a 4-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, independently and without any way of comparing notes, described Him to be. I am no longer the small girl who picked up a pencil in a house in Illinois. I am a grown woman now, and I have spent more than 2 decades trying to do one thing well, trying to make plain, in whatever medium is available to me, what I was shown in a place that words and even paint can only gesture toward. I have painted hundreds of works since that night. I have watched some of them travel further than I ever could have imagined a child's painting traveling, into hospitals, into prisons, into the hands of people in the final hours of their lives who needed, more than anything else, a doorway through which something real could reach them. I did not know, at 8 years old, that this was what I was agreeing to. I only knew that I had to say yes. And looking back now, across all the years between that night and this moment, I can tell you with complete certainty that the yes was worth everything it cost. Every year of isolation, every moment of being doubted, questioned, looked at with a particular careful skepticism that people reserve for claims they want to believe but are afraid to fully trust. Every hour spent at a canvas trying to close a gap I knew I would never fully close. All of it was worth it. Because I was not just painting pictures. I was building doorways. And every person who has stood in front of one of those paintings and felt something shift in them, some quiet and unexpected recognition, some sense of being looked at by eyes that knew them completely and loved them anyway, every one of those moments was the fulfillment of what I said yes to in that overwhelming light when I was 8 years old. I want to tell you what I understand now about the nature of what I encountered, because I think it matters more than any of the specific details I have shared with you so far. God is not distant. I know that is not what most people expect to hear from someone with a story like mine. They expect the vastness, the overwhelming scale, the descriptions of light and beings and music beyond anything available to ordinary perception. And all of that is true. But underneath all of it, more fundamental than any of it, is this: God is not distant. He did not require me to travel to some far corner of existence to find him. He met me exactly where I was, in the small and unremarkable circumstances of a 4-year-old's bedroom in rural Illinois, in a family with no religious framework, with no preparation, with nothing that would have suggested I was a likely candidate for an encounter with eternity. He came to me. And I think that is the most important thing I can tell anyone who is watching this and wondering whether what I am describing has anything to do with their own life. You do not need the right family. You do not need the right theological education. You do not need to have earned it through years of devotion or to have positioned yourself correctly through religious practice. You only need to be willing to receive him when he comes. And he is always coming. I thought of Revelation chapter 3 verse 20, a verse I did not know as an 8-year-old and that I now return to often. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. I stand at the door and knock. Not waiting to be summoned through the correct ritual. Not requiring the right credentials before he will consider approaching. Standing at the door. Knocking. Patiently. Persistently. For as long as it takes. The God I encounter does not wait for us to become worthy of his presence. He stands at the door of every single life, yours included, whoever you are, wherever you are right now, whatever you believe or do not yet believe, and he knocks, and he waits, and he does not grow tired of waiting. I want to speak to you directly now. If you have ever felt strange or set apart, carrying something inside you that the people around you do not seem to understand, I want you to hear this from someone who lived inside that particular loneliness for years. What feels like strangeness might be calling. What feels like isolation might be the specific and necessary shape of being entrusted with something meant to travel further than you can currently see. You are not too unusual to be used. You are not too different to be loved completely. The very things that make you feel set apart might be the exact things God intends to use to reach people that no one else could reach. If you are afraid that what you have experienced, a moment of unexplainable peace, a sense of presence you cannot account for, a feeling of being known by something larger than yourself, if you are afraid that no one will believe you, I want you to know that belief is not actually the point. Truth does not require an audience to remain true. What I saw in that place was real before anyone believed me and would have remained real even if no one ever had. Your experience does not need validation to be valid. It needs only your willingness to keep being faithful to what you know, even while you wait, as I waited for years, for confirmation that may or may not ever come in a form as dramatic as a 4-year-old boy recognizing a painting. And if you have never had an experience like mine, if you are watching this from the outside of everything I have described, wondering whether any of it could possibly include you, I want to tell you what I believe with everything I am. He is standing at your door right now. Not because of anything you have done. Not because you have prepared yourself correctly or arrived at the right point in your spiritual journey. Because that is who he is. He is the one who comes to the unprepared. The one who chose a 4-year-old with no religious background instead of waiting for someone more obviously qualified. The one who has been knocking, patiently, at the door of your life for longer than you have been aware of the knocking. You only have to open the door. I think of the painting I am still working on, even now, decades after that first drawing. I will never finish closing the gap between what I remember and what I am able to put on canvas. I have made peace with that. The gap itself, I have come to understand, is not a failure. It is an invitation for everyone who looks at the work I have done and senses there is more beyond it, more than paint can hold, more than any human medium could ever fully contain. That more is real. It is waiting. And it loves you specifically, completely, and without any condition you could fail to meet. I was 8 years old when I was shown a place more real than anything I had known before that moment. I am no longer 8 years old. But the place has not become less real with time. If anything, every year that passes confirms it more deeply, through the convergence with Colton's testimony, through the quiet moments when people write to tell me that one of my paintings reached them in their darkest hour, through the simple and unshakable fact that the memory of that light has never once, in over 2 decades, faded or weakened or become less certain than it was the night I first opened my eyes inside it. It is real. He is real. And he is waiting for you the way he waited for me, patiently, completely, without requiring anything from you except your willingness to finally open the door. If this testimony has reached something in you today, if some part of you recognized, even faintly, the truth of what I have described, there are more voices waiting for you here on this channel. More people who crossed into that same reality from different circumstances and came back carrying pieces of the same truth. Each testimony is another witness. Each witness makes the next one easier to believe. Subscribe and stay close. Because every week we bring another voice home. And every voice, in its own way, from its own door, is saying the same thing. He is here. He has always been here. And he is waiting for you to open the door.